Muchas gracias. Buenos días, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Jackie O'Reilly, Presidente de SASE. And I'm afraid that is as far as my Spanish goes. I don't want to hurt anybody's ears with my terrible pronunciation. I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Amy Offner to give us the closing address to this wonderful conference. And I have been following some of the discussions with great interest. And while I know there have been a few hitches, can I send a big thank you to Santos and Yulimar and the whole SASE team to have organised this event in such challenging times. When we discussed with Santos and Yulimar who should give this address, Amy immediately came to mind for very many reasons. She is a young, imaginative scholar that brings a wealth of innovative approaches to her historical, political and economic analysis. Her recent book, Sorting Out the Mixed Economy, has received a number of eminent awards, including the Alice Amsden Award from SASE. The committee reviewing a range of books that went forward for this award commented on her book that won the prize. This book is fluidly and elegantly written. Her extensively researched historical analysis engages with a large interdisciplinary literature in economic sociology, political science and economics. And this is really at the heart of what SASE is about. The Alice Amsden Award acknowledges the importance contribution of Alice Amsden to heterodox economics and interdisciplinary research in understanding relations between emerging and established economies. Alice argued that due to the massive overseas investment in regions like Latin America, economic decisions were often made not by state actors, but by multinational firms outside those jurisdictions. And she also argued that it was important to study developed countries closely because there are a lot of people out there that are disappointed and are desperately want to improve their living conditions and social standards. And Amy's work follows very much in this tradition. She shows how the influence of Latin American developmentalism on the formation of the North American welfare state. And I also want to thank her for volunteering to organise a special session at the conference in Amsterdam around Alice's work. And hopefully some of you will be able to join us and to continue the discussion. And then we can continue it in Rio. And after that, we are going to Limerick in Ireland. So you're all very welcome to join us. And I can tell you, there'll be lots of hugging going on in Limerick for those of you who like that kind of thing. And it's always also important to mention life before and outside the academy to show that we're not living just in ivory towers. And Amy's career so clearly does this, having worked as a union organizer and an editor of the magazine Dollars and Cents, as a book publisher. And in 2008, she worked for the Landmine Survivor Network in Bogota, Colombia. So Amy, thank you very much for giving this lecture today. We are really looking forward to this, and thank you very much for coming.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias por la presentación muy generosa, por la invitación. Y como historiadora es un placer y un honor tener la oportunidad de hablar con esta comunidad interdisciplinaria e internacional. Hoy voy a discutir el libro que escribí recientemente que se llama Sorting Out the Mixed Economy. Voy a hablar en inglés, pero por supuesto ustedes pueden chatear y hacer preguntas en español. Entonces voy a compartir la pantalla. Okay. Bueno. Sorting Out the Mixed Economy travels through river valleys and housing complexes, job training centers, economic planning offices, and college classrooms in order to understand how governments in the capitalist economies of Colombia and the United States first took on widening functions during the decades after 1945, and then how their functions were dismantled, reassigned, and redefined after the 1970s. The book ultimately makes two central points. First, it reveals the influence of Latin American developmentalism on the formation of the US welfare state and on the intellectual and political life of the North Atlantic. So in that sense, it takes a central insight of post-colonial studies, the idea that imperialism shapes metropoles, and it applies that idea to the history of the United States. Second, the book argues that a number of practices that we tend to regard today as quintessentially neoliberal inventions actually had earlier lives as developmentalist phenomena. So it finds things that we tend not to remember about mid-century statecraft. It finds things like austere systems of social welfare provision, or evolving methods of state decentralization, or novel forms of for-profit and private delegation of state functions. The book concludes that capitalism in the late 20th century wasn't built in simple reaction against Keynesianism and developmentalism. Instead, it was a parasitic formation that appropriated and redeployed key elements of the very order that it destroyed. This argument was my attempt to resolve what I thought had become confounding puzzles within the burgeoning literature on the origins of neoliberalism. Most writing on that subject, I think for good reason, has depicted the 1970s and 1980s as a moment of cataclysmic rupture, a time when spectacularly marginal ideas obliterated everything that had come before. Much of this literature suggests, moreover, that those ideas originated in the North Atlantic and mainly among intellectual and political communities on the right. And I think that for all that those accounts have taught us, they leave us with some perplexing problems. Many purportedly novel practices of the late 20th century, including the techniques of state restructuring and social welfare provision that my book explores, they had very long and tangled roots that extended into welfare and developmental states themselves. Some of the leading policymakers at the World Bank and the IMF were, in fact, Latin Americans who believed that they were carrying forward the lessons of mid-century statecraft. Radical liberalization programs rarely relied on coups or massive purges, but instead they drew strength from existing institutions and from officials who had very long careers inside the state. So my book presents a different understanding of the way that political economic orders give way, an understanding that first recognizes the mid-century third world as a vital source of ideas, and an understanding that accounts for continuities between successive forms of capitalism. The book is based on research that I did in over 30 archives and repositories in the United States and Colombia, as well as oral history interviews that I did in both countries. It's a book that ranges pretty widely across domains of life, and it moves up and down scales from local land conflicts to the functioning of international financial institutions. So what I want to do today is just give you a sort of a taste of this research by looking at two practices that built Colombia's developmental state, then were adapted in the North Atlantic, and then eventually became redeployed to take apart mid-century states in both regions. So the first practice is state decentralization. I think it is a very curious fact that both the making and the unmaking of welfare and developmental states relied on forms of state decentralization that their champions hailed as historically unprecedented. Decentralization was, in fact, an enduring and characteristic form of government in the Americas by the time of the Great Depression. It was reimagined and redeployed twice during the subsequent years, first as a developmentalist prescription to expand the responsibilities of weak states, and then later as an instrument to break down existing state functions. So we can take one example, the birth of Colombia's first regional development corporation, which was known as the Cauca Valley Corporation, or the CVC. What you see on the screen here are some of the founders and early contractors of the CVC. The CVC was founded in 1954 as a river valley development agency located in one of the richest agricultural regions of Latin America, namely Colombia's Cauca Valley. It was spearheaded by local capitalists in that region. These were the leaders of ANDI, or the Asociación Nacional de Industriales, which was and remains Colombia's most powerful business association in the United States. It's roughly equivalent to the National Association of Manufacturers. These were cosmopolitan capitalists, and they enlisted supporters from the World Bank, the US and Colombian governments, and they also enlisted international advisors, including David Lilienthal, a really noted New Dealer who was the former chairman of the Tennessee Valley Authority in the United States. Together, these Colombian capitalists and their international supporters mobilized stories about the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was an iconic New Deal agency, in order to impress their own lessons on the Colombian government. They argued that the Tennessee Valley Authority had demonstrated the value of decentralized public administration, and they forced the Colombian government to devolve an extraordinary range of powers to the CVC. The CVC's conception of decentralization was time-bound. It was not the same as the prescriptions that emerged in the 1980s and 1990s. In its moment, this conception of decentralization had two aspects. First, it had an impulse toward regionalism. Establishing the CVC required devolving national power to a regional body, and indeed inventing the natural region of the river valley as a new jurisdiction in Colombian governance. And second, this form of decentralization had an impulse toward privatization. It blurred the line between public and private authority as the national state vested powers in private businessmen and remade public enterprise in the image of the for-profit private sector corporation. I traced the CVC's history from the 1950s to the 1990s, showing first how its conception of decentralization became really central to statecraft during the National Front, which was the anti-communist coalition government that ruled Colombia from 1958 to 1974. During these years, the CVC became a model for other regional development corporations throughout Colombia, and it campaigned tirelessly for its version of decentralization. This is an image from a CVC campaign that began in the 1960s to defend the powers of the country's regional development corporations. It exposes the purported truth of centralism, which is a Bogotano businessman milking the agriculturally rich Cauca Valley. The capitalists who led the CVC were regional boosters. They wanted to wield state power in order to strengthen their hand in local social conflicts. And in the book, I show how they used state power, for instance, to dispossess thousands of campesinos during the era of land reform in the 1960s. So they certainly wanted to wield state power, but they did not want to answer to the capital. They did not want to answer to Bogota. And they depicted the national state as a usurping, exploitative outside force. As the CVC championed its version of decentralization during these decades, it also became a training ground for a new generation of professional economists whose careers extended from the heyday of developmentalism into its twilight. Economics was, of course, invented as an independent discipline in Latin America after the Great Depression, and my book explores the struggles of a nascent profession to establish the nature of economic knowledge, to distinguish economics from management, and to carve out a jurisdiction for economists within the developmental state. I argue that the developmental state itself profoundly shaped the economic ideas of Colombia's first generation of professional economists. It inculcated in them an enduring interest in state restructuring that they carried into the 1980s and 1990s. So I follow the careers of figures like the Colombian economist Eduardo Wiesner, who we can see here on the screen as he's generally known outside Colombia. Wiesner became the Western Hemisphere director of the IMF in the 1980s, which means that he played a central role in negotiating structural adjustment agreements all throughout Latin America. A decade later, in the 1990s, he became a consultant on state decentralization at the World Bank, where he argued that decentralization was an essential adjunct to structural adjustment. I show how his writing on decentralization in those decades wasn't sui generis or reactive against the mid-century state in any simple way. Wiesner had never been a dissident outsider to mid-century state building. He was a product of it. His interest in decentralization dated to the 1960s when he was a young man in Bogota and an admiring analyst of Colombia's decentralized agencies. Over the course of decades, Wiesner turned the concept of decentralization over in his mind. He refashioned it and he redeployed it to meet new crises until finally in the 1980s, he proposed to create a completely restructured decentralized state, one that took power away from mid-century agencies that had once symbolized decentralization in Colombia, and then handed power and responsibility instead to departments and municipios. The result was quite a different conception of decentralization, one that we tend to remember as a replacement for an old centralized system. Our memory of decentralization as a practice associated with the demise of the mid-century state and not its construction owes to the self-understanding of figures like Wiesner, who in the 1980s and 1990s distinguished their prescriptions from older ones by constructing a retrospective understanding of the mid-century state as a centralized behemoth. In doing so, they obscured the origins of their own ideas, and they erased the long, tangled lineage of the practice that they promoted. Throughout my book, I find people doing exactly what Wiesner did. They were drawing out what they considered the true lessons of development projects, and in the process, they were producing quite unexpected prescriptions. The foil to Wiesner in the book is David Lilienthal, who drew his own lesson from the history of the CVC. If Wiesner adapted the impulse toward regionalism that was in the CVC's charter, then Lilienthal drew out the impulse toward privatization. Lilienthal was born in 1899, and he became one of the most notable faces of the New Deal during the 1930s and 1940s. He chaired the Tennessee Valley Authority, and he went on to direct the Atomic Energy Commission for the US government. This image of him on the screen would surprise most US historians who know him as a symbol of public enterprise and public regulation. But as I show, in the 1950s, David Lilienthal embarked on a second public career as a private businessman. And he actually wrote a book defending the sprawling modern corporation. His book was called Big Business. And the image on the screen is the cover of a condensed version of that book that General Motors published and distributed to employees in order to counteract labor and the left in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, Lilienthal remade himself as an international development consultant, peddling lessons from the TVA, and he found his first contract in Colombia. He quickly became entangled in a host of business development projects that surrounded the CVC. Perhaps the most consequential of those was the creation of the first MBA program in Colombia, which was founded at the Universidad del Valle, which was the local public university in the city of Cali. The book has a lot to say about the rivalrous entanglement of economics and management as disciplines and professions, and I would be happy to talk more about that in the chat afterwards. But for now, suffice it to say that the CVC illuminates what I see as a systemic tension at the heart of the developmental state. Here was a public development agency directed by the leaders of a private business association. Here was a state enterprise vested with national powers for the express purpose of underwriting the growth of private enterprise. The CVC equated the interests of a portion of the Cauca Valley's capitalist class with the general interest or the public interest. That elision was characteristic of mid-century developmentalism in capitalist economies. During the 1960s, we see that elision manifested within the local public university, which of course trained economists to become government planners, and which simultaneously touted the training of industrial managers as one of the university's chief contributions to the community and the public. The growth of the public university actually created financial mechanisms that enriched local and multinational corporations, and leaders of the management program took on leadership roles within the university, promising to rationalize public higher education by applying techniques of industrial management to it. David Lilienthal put his name and some of his own money behind the university's management program, and so did a host of US business schools, US business associations, the Ford Foundation, and organizations of US foreign investors in Latin America. The management program at the Universidad del Valle quickly became the anchor for a network of institutions linking the Cauca Valley to US business groups and foreign aid programs. In 1963, the Peace Corps began sending young business school graduates from the US to teach in the management program and work as consultants for the CVC and local business organizations. The next year, David Rockefeller of Chase Manhattan Bank led a group of US business executives in founding what was called the International Executive Service Corps, sometimes known as the Paunch Corps, a play on the Peace Corps. This was a Peace Corps for retired corporate executives who became volunteer management consultants in the Third World, supported by US government development aid. The International Executive Service Corps was funded primarily by the US Agency for International Development, and its founders hailed it as a model of, quote, public-private initiative because a board of US businessmen directed it and channeled USAID's money directly to Latin American enterprises rather than Latin American government agencies. These US businessmen valued the symbolism of private capital controlling the disbursement of public revenues, serving public functions, and mediating between states and societies. They depicted businessmen as statesmen, and this project formed part of a much wider effort that I analyze among US foreign investors in Latin America to capitalize on foreign aid by funneling it through and to the private sector. Now, of course, this was never an uncontested project. In fact, the Universidad del Valle produced a ferociously radical student movement during the late 1960s and 1970s that ultimately destroyed the management and economics programs founded during the 1950s and generated rival forms of knowledge. This student movement produced some very notable Colombian intellectuals, including the anthropologist Arturo Escobar, whose 1995 book, Encountering Development, famously set out to bury the entire project of developmentalism and became a classic and sort of much debated book in post-colonial studies. But if we think back to the formative years of the Universidad del Valle's management program, what's interesting to me is that US businessmen were meeting in Latin America, summoned there by Colombian capitalists, and together they were insinuating themselves into the region's development programs during the early 1960s, that is to say, the era of the Kennedy administration. By the time President Lyndon Johnson launched the War on Poverty in the United States in 1964, many US businessmen who were veterans of development programs overseas believed that grand questions about the role of private capital in public life had already been resolved. And they saw the Johnson administration's expansion of social welfare spending in the United States as an opportunity to apply their tools across the US state. So they turned homeward, promising to repatriate what they saw as the lessons of development. Lilienthal is an exemplary case here. During the 1960s, he returned to the US public eye, speaking no longer as Mr. TBA, but rather as a businessman working in a particularly auspicious field, namely economic development. Lilienthal argued that the lesson of his work overseas was that states could best fulfill their functions by delegating them to private capital. He pointed to the businessmen of the Cauca Valley, and he pointed to his own for-profit consulting firm to argue that a new kind of corporate manager had appeared on the world stage, a moral hero and a patriot fit to resolve the crises of post-war societies. Lilienthal was one of a generation of US businessmen who turned home, who shifted their sights from the third world to the first world in the 1960s, following the enticements of federal budget appropriations. And they came home declaring themselves public servants fit to solve the problems that US social movements had forced onto the national agenda. Their mobilization produced an epochal change in the US welfare state. During the War on Poverty, they convinced the Johnson administration to begin operating federal training and education programs by for-profit contracting with the country's largest industrial corporations. So this is an ad that was placed in the pages of Foreign Affairs as well as the Financial Analysts Journal by International Telephone and Telegraph, or ITT. ITT was, of course, a military contractor and a foreign investor deeply involved in shaping US aid in Latin America during the 1960s. It is most notorious, of course, as a collaborator with military dictatorships in Latin America. Under the War on Poverty, ITT also became the operator of the first Job Corps camp in the United States, Job Corps being one of the central job training programs of the US anti-poverty program. So ITT ran the Kilmer Job Corps Center in New Jersey. And this is how job training programs worked in the War on Poverty, not only Job Corps, but a whole range of training programs, including those run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs for indigenous people living on reservations. It was a notable departure from the New Deal's training programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, which had been operated by the federal government itself. The firms that argued for this arrangement came from the world of foreign and imperial policy. That is to say, they came from the world of development assistance that I've been looking at. They also came from the worlds of military contracting and Indian industrialization policy that the Bureau of Indian Affairs had launched on reservations during the 1950s. The US state had long relied on for-profit contracting to conduct foreign and imperial affairs, and corporations that were experienced in those fields argued in the 1960s that they had a portfolio of proven contracting and budgeting procedures that they could carry from the purported edges of the nation into the heart of the welfare state. The ad here explicitly references that military experience, noting in the text that service, they say, is the company's business, from helping to make war on unemployment to helping defend the free world. The book looks inside training centers in US cities and on Indian reservations and shows how the attempt to extract profit from training embedded irresolvable contradictions within the US welfare state. To take one example, on the Navajo reservation, federal job training subsidies went to the Fairchild Camera and Instrument Corporation, which opened a transistor assembly plant in the city of Shiprock, New Mexico in 1965. Here we see one of the workers at the plant, a Navajo woman. Fairchild opened the plant as part of a long-standing hunt for low-wage, non-union labor that was leading electronics firms and other labor-intensive industries out of northern cities and across the globe. Among historians, Jefferson Cowie's work has made RCA and the electronics industry preeminent symbols of 20th century capital flight that devastated major manufacturing centers and hobbled the US labor movement. Indian country and the war on poverty form a forgotten part of that story. During the 1950s and 1960s, reservation industrialization policies were explicitly designed to exploit capital mobility and bring footloose capital to reservations. They touted on-the-job training programs as public subsidies to electronics manufacturers that were shifting labor-intensive production across the US. Indian country is a frontier again. This is a headline for an article written by an official from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the US government agency, in 1969, and it was published in the magazine of the US Chamber of Commerce. Throughout the 1960s, tribal governments and the US federal government brought over 150 new factories to reservations, in part by offering on-the-job training funds that let companies pay workers just half the minimum wage while the federal government paid the rest. These on-the-job training programs promised to respond simultaneously to the demands of employers for cheap labor, the nationalist dreams of tribal officials, and the aspirations of Native workers who were facing catastrophic levels of poverty and unemployment. It was ultimately impossible to meet all three of those expectations in equal measure. Fairchild became infamous for running what was supposedly a transitional job training program for nearly 10 years, maintaining a constant flow of trainees who they paid half the minimum wage, shunting the rest of the wage payment onto the federal government. The company essentially used anti-poverty funds to put its factory beyond the reach of the Fair Labor Standards Act, that New Deal law that had established the federal minimum wage. After a decade of operation, workers began organizing a union. The Bureau of Indian Affairs itself threatened to cut training funds, and the American Indian Movement, which was a radical youth movement, took over the factory to publicize the workers' grievances. So as workers organized and as job training subsidies seemed about to run out, Fairchild did what electronics manufacturers had always done in those circumstances. It shut the factory and it moved production. Workers who had gone to Shiprock looking for employment found themselves inside a program that Fairchild was using to undermine the long-term prospect of stable, well-paying employment in the United States. On Indian reservations, the War on Poverty's job training programs had deliberately exploited a notorious pattern of capital flight, and they ultimately exposed workers to the devastating consequences of that practice. By 1967, the War on Poverty's job training contractors were capitalizing on their experience in manpower policy to represent themselves now as general authorities on education. They began to win contracts with US public schools during the 1960s. Initially, they won small contracts with local school districts, And in 1970, they received a boost when the Nixon administration signed what were called performance contracts that sent for-profit corporations into 18 public school districts across the country. This is a 1970 cartoon drawn by a public school art teacher in Connecticut. His name was Tom Howd, and it was published by his union, the American Federation of Teachers, and it's satirizing performance contracting. We see here the fictional Ajax Learning Corporation telling the local Board of Education, ours is a cash or a crash program in education, sign right here. Performance contracting was a procedure taken from the Pentagon. It referred to the practice of outsourcing functions to private industry and paying on the basis of measurable results, in this case, standardized test scores. The application of performance contracting to education in the late 1960s and 1970s illuminated yet another way in which the welfare state was built in the United States by adapting procedures from foreign policy. What we see here is actually the origins of for-profit educational contracting in the United States, which is often imagined as a very recent invention, but was in fact born as an instrument to build the welfare state in the 1960s. That is not to say that it was a benign practice or that anyone should regard it with nostalgia. Instead, it reveals the contradictions of the welfare state, which was shaped by capital and was in very important ways a service to capital. We seem to have come a very long way from David Lilienthal, TVA chairman, but what's interesting in all of this is that David Lilienthal's career was woven through this whole story. Lilienthal spent the 1960s as a kind of organic intellectual among US businessmen. He was a member of domestic business associations and a prolific writer and speaker who made the case for private capital as a guarantor of the public good. By the 1970s, Lilienthal participated in writing a report at the Committee for Economic Development that celebrated performance contracting in US public schools. From Lilienthal's point of view, these new prescriptions for-profit contracting in social services were not the undoing of the New Deal or of mid-century developmentalism in Latin America. Rather, he thought that they were the final product of a long crusade against state centralism that he believed he had been engaged in since his own days as a New Dealer. So we've seen here multiple adaptations of the principle of state decentralization. On the one hand, Eduardo Wiesner reimagined the mid-century commitment to regionalism by proposing to redistribute state powers across the national territory and among subnational governments according to a new pattern in the era of structural adjustment. And on the other hand, Lilienthal turned the idea of state decentralization into new prescriptions for-profit privatization of social services. The second phenomenon that I explore is the growth of austere build-your-own-home programs. During the early 1960s, the Colombian capital of Bogotá became the site of the largest housing project built in all of Latin America under the Alliance for Progress. And you see it on the screen here. Ciudad Kennedy was initially designed to house 84,000 people, and it became an international exemplar of what was called aided self-help housing. This was a characteristic policy of mid-century developmentalism. The program assigned governments the tasks of titling land, extending mortgage loans, supplying materials, and supervising construction, while housing recipients themselves they built the housing, they paid off their mortgage loans, and they became private property owners. Aided self-help allowed cash-strapped governments to fulfill their mandates by transferring to homeowners the burdens that they couldn't bear themselves. In Colombia, it illuminated the essential hybridity of the developmental state. One of the country's most prominent decentralized agencies of the 1930s financed the homes. Private volunteer labor erected them, and the final product was a homeowning middle class that idealized private property and demanded that the government deliver it. The austerity of the project is not much remembered today, but it was actually characteristic of social policy under the Alliance for Progress. The 1960s are often remembered as a time of public munificence, but that was never quite so in the areas of housing, health, and education. Those areas of social policy were generally circumscribed by the fiscal strangulation of a government that struggled to raise tax revenues, and also by the terms of US and World Bank loans. The US and the World Bank both maintained that if a country wanted to accelerate growth, then it had to concentrate its public investments in industrial production and closely related infrastructure. So for the time being, social welfare programs had to function on a shoestring. As a result, the Colombian government and US development agencies preferred programs like self-help housing, a system that deliberately pushed costs onto recipients themselves and demanded that they perform a great deal of unpaid labor. Housing planners who were working inside the poorly financed social agencies of the third world generated a model of social welfare provision that was internally suited just as well to an era of fiscal retrenchment. Looking out from Colombia, my book explores the adaptation of self-help housing at the World Bank and in the United States itself, where it actually became a national rural housing policy in the 1960s under the War on Poverty. I've emphasized the austerity of the program, but in both Colombia and the United States, we really see the contradictory promises of a program that was certainly austere, but that was also decisively extending the reach and responsibilities of the welfare state. In the US, self-help housing directed federal housing funds to farm workers and to Indians living on reservations who before the 1960s had little to no access to federal homeownership programs. The champions of this policy in the United States included Native American nations, Bureau of Indian Affairs officials, both of whom were trying to rebuild life on reservations after over a decade in which the federal government had been trying to dissolve reservations. Social Democrats in the United States promoted self-help housing as one small piece of a much larger housing program for the United States that was centered on tenant-controlled public housing. The program's champions also included African Americans who were systematically shut out of the conventional mortgage market by redlining and discriminatory real estate practices. Indeed, the peregrinations of self-help housing expose the multiple circuits that connected the US and Latin America. We've already seen the circuits that were forged by businessmen whose firms lived and died by public subsidies and who made a place for themselves within every anti-communist state project that would have them. In self-help housing, we see instead the internationalisms of a variety of dissenters on the North American continent who assigned their own ideals to the owner-built home. This is an image from California's San Joaquin Valley, where the American Friends Service Committee created one of the United States' most prominent self-help housing organizations during the early 1960s. It was called Self-Help Enterprises. The American Friends Service Committee was and is still today a Quaker organization committed to pacifism and racial equality. Self-Help Enterprises became the first self-help housing group in the United States to receive federal funding under the War on Poverty, and it very quickly became a national model. Here in California and across the United States, self-help housing was building the welfare state, but it was a really peculiar strategy for doing so. While it brought federal funds to people and to communities that had had precious little access to them before, the program also retreated from the model of public housing in that it channeled much smaller subsidies to the poor, and it sidelined public property ownership as a foundation of shared economic security. From the 1960s to the 1980s, I show how self-help housing passed hand to hand, crossing world regions and crossing decades, becoming ever more austere and diminutive in the process, until eventually these programs became symbols of neoliberal capitalism and post-developmentalism. The policy acquired fundamentally new meanings over time. By the 1980s, the champions of owner building policies cast their work as an alternative to what they called mid-century statism. And they retrospectively depicted projects like Ciudad Kennedy as government housing built by a state that was supposedly an improvident leviathan. So what should we make of these observations? I want to be very clear that I'm not arguing that the form of capitalism that existed at the end of the 20th century existed in the 1930s or the 1960s. I regard the political economic transformation of the late 20th century as a shattering event that dealt a blow to labor movements worldwide, brought economic inequality to heights not seen since the 1920s, and inaugurated a very new kind of political economy. What I think this history does is help us think about how political economic orders give way. For good reason, much writing on the unraveling of welfare and developmentalist projects has depicted roughly half a century of conflict between right and left and between capital and labor, culminating in a political and intellectual coup from the right during the successive crises of 1973 to 1991. The oil shocks and stagflation, the debt crisis, the collapse of the Soviet Union. These stories' protagonists are rightfully known to us all today because they earned their ignominy. They include neoclassical and Austrian economists, right-wing business and religious networks, military dictators, the Carter, Reagan, and Clinton administrations, the World Bank, the IMF, and an army of US foundations and think tanks. These stories rely, though, on an image of a world turned upside down through the mobilization of the right and through overwhelming southward projections of power from the North Atlantic into the Third World. Those dynamics are clearly very important, but this image of how historical change takes place, I think, would surprise scholars of other epochal transformations. If we think back to, say, the Age of Revolutions, or the era of slave emancipation, or the crisis of the Great Depression, or the post-war process of decolonization. All of those upheavals remade societies not by inverting their every feature, but by extinguishing a few of their defining elements and breathing new life into others. All of them were also multi-sided transnational processes in which influence moved in many directions across lines of imperial, national, and social division. And all of them involved a great deal of narration in the moment and commemoration afterward that produced memories of past orders convenient to the projects that succeeded them. I regard our own world as the product of just such an epochal transformation, and I see stories of total rupture and inversion as a form of memory that clarifies conflicts in the present day, and in that sense makes contemporary political conflict possible while also obscuring much about the past. In place of this image of a world turned upside down, or of a marginal set of ideas displacing all that came before, I've come to think of the conflicts of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s as having sorted mid-century practices from one another, obliterating some of them, redeploying others, and retrospectively redefining them all as elements of two different eras. I call this the process of sorting out the mixed economy, and I want to take a minute to explain that language. In the United States, Colombia, and much of the first and third worlds, mid-century policymakers and intellectuals, of course, commonly invoked the notion of a mixed economy to describe capitalist orders. It was an evocative term of its time, and I think it's a powerful concept for us to think with when we think about history. In its moment, the mixed economy was an imagined path between laissez-faire and socialism, or between the stylized ideals of pure private competition and complete state ownership. In that wide expanse grew a remarkable variety of lived practices. States grew by local and private devolution. Tax-starved governments supplemented public spending with private volunteer labor. And businessmen made claims to be legitimate stewards of the state. By design and as a point of pride, every project of purported state-led development was in equal measure a private initiative. Every national economic plan intersected with a business plan, and policymakers routinely debated just which government agency or for-profit corporation or nonprofit community organization could best carry out a given task under very immediate circumstances. Mixed economies relied upon the imagined dichotomy between public and private, while systematically conjoining the two, producing manifold articulations of state and capital and multiple accounts of the relationship between public and private interest. Self-help housing, state decentralization, and for-profit educational contracting are illustrative examples of policies that could and did thrive under the banner of a mixed economy, and which found new uses after the 1970s under the banner of different ideals that were equally notional and aspirational: the market, the entrepreneur, or the minimal state. But of course, not every feature of mid-century statecraft could survive the crises of the 1970s and 80s. The world at the end of the 20th century was new precisely because it contained only pieces of the past. New demands for fiscal retrenchment and regressive redistribution functioned as a sieve that sorted mid-century practices from each other, imperiling or annihilating some while putting others to new ends. In the United States, federal budget cuts dealt a blow to conventional public housing while leaving a thin lifeline that sustains self-help housing. The Reagan administration vilified cash transfer programs while furnishing fresh opportunities to the War on Poverty's educational contractors, some of which live on today as private prison contractors and for-profit school assessment firms. In all of these cases, the policies that endured tended to be those that channeled less generous subsidies to poor people themselves and promised less progressive redistribution of income. The institutions that survived tended to be private entrepreneurial ones that the mid-century state had cultivated. For instance, nonprofit real estate developers that emerged from the world of self-help housing, or for-profit corporate subsidiaries that had been born in service of manpower training. The epilogue to the book is largely an essay about historical memory. It is my attempt to explain why we don't tend to remember the mid-century origins of these institutions and policies. And I think it's because our understandings of them are of very recent vintage. They were forged in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s in the very process of dismantling welfare and developmental states. The work of political economic restructuring involved a great deal of storytelling about what the mid-century state had been. I find storytellers among the economists in the World Bank and IMF, people like Eduardo Wiesner. I find storytellers among businessmen whose accounts of a world turned upside down affirmed their own understanding of themselves as sources of innovation. And I find storytellers among the right-wing intellectuals who are the protagonists of most books on neoliberalism, men like Milton Friedman, or men like Hernando de Soto, the Peruvian economist whose best-selling 1986 book, The Other Path, popularized a right-wing libertarian view of the owner-built home as a novel alternative to mid-century statism. These men aggrandized themselves as intellectual iconoclasts and policy innovators, bringing a new world into being. They were certainly participants in a dramatic transformation, but I don't think they were quite as innovative or quite as politically and intellectually autonomous as they claimed to be. Very often they were picking up ideas and practices left lying around by an earlier generation of state makers. What's interesting to me is that their triumphalist narratives about their own extraordinary accomplishments have come to inform critics of neoliberalism who tell much the same story in a minor key. Most of the scholarship on neoliberalism reinforces the essential claims of celebratory narratives that originated on the right, presenting the same periodization of the 20th century and attributing political economic change to the same set of intellectuals and institutions. The result is a form of historical memory that's neither of the right nor of the left, but rather a shared way of imagining the recent past that has become foundational to contemporary political conflict. As people who are living in this moment, we are all soaking in this form of historical memory. And I think that that's a tremendous challenge to those of us who are trying to write about political economy in the last century. I think that our task is both to analyze economic life and also to sometimes analyze the popular tellings of history that shape and sometimes constrain our own inquiry. So that is what this book tries to do. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to a conversation. I guess we're going to be moving now over to a different platform for that.
Well, first of all, Amy, thank you very much. That's absolutely brilliant presentation and fascinating outline of your argument and the depth of research that's gone into it. So I really massively appreciate it. I thought it was excellent. For the rest of the people here, if you have a question, if you'd like to put it into the Q&A button on the bottom right hand corner, I can ask that to Amy and we can have a discussion like that. I'm afraid we can't have a more interactive one for various reasons. So does anybody first of all have a question? Sorry, Santos, did you want to say something?
Jacqueline, yes, I would like to do a question. One comment to Amy. It's quite interesting your description of the situation. about the public policy in housing, it looks like we don't learn anything in 50 years, in a half of century, you know. So 50 years later, we are in the same situation. There are no public policies about the housing for poor people. But also in other areas of the, for example, health, the care of family or care of elderly people it's like 50 years in black. Yeah. What do you think about that?
You know, it's really interesting. I don't feel hopeless, and I hope the book does not lead to hopelessness. I think that to the extent that there's sort of something that the book has to say to the present, it's that, you know, we are living at a time where I think, you know, current forms of political economy are discredited in a way that haven't, I think, been the case since the 1930s. And it's a moment of kind of radical uncertainty about what the future will be, which doesn't necessarily mean that we should all be optimistic and Pollyanna, because we could have a very terrible future. But there are a lot of openings right now. The, you know, political contestation is really fierce. And I think that the book suggests that we need to be so much more ambitious right now than really anything that was tried in the anti-communist mixed economies of the mid-20th century, which isn't to say that there's nothing to reach back into and think about, but that we're not going to get very far through kind of a nostalgic look at the years between the 1930s and 1960s. I think that the governments I'm looking at were so profoundly compromised by anti-communism, quite frankly, that there were many possibilities that were not on the table in this, you know, in the states that I'm looking at. But I do think that it's very interesting the way that historical memory is working right now, where, for instance, the discussion of like a Green New Deal is something that is reaching back into the past, not in a literal way, actually, but it's selectively pulling out elements of kind of mid-century policy to construct the image of actually a new political economy that would be much more egalitarian than anything that existed like in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, or 60s. And I think that there are social movements today that are, you know, trying to imagine forms of political economy that are, first of all, I think much less constrained by the anti-communism of the Cold War, and that are open to forms of, you know, public goods that I think should exist. I guess I do take hope from that, and I don't think that the book is designed to sort of the book is designed to understand how historical memory is working today, but not to tell people that there's no reason to look into the past or to denigrate what I think are some kind of politically productive forms of historical memory that are taking place on the left right now. In terms of the question about health, I mean, I think that it's also important to recognize that, right, this book doesn't look at all forms of social welfare provision or all forms of developmentalism. And there is a lot in the past to look at. I mean, the United States was certainly an outlier in the, you know, in its reliance on welfare capitalism to deliver healthcare. And in the mid-century world, there were many superior alternatives. And I think that that is going to be the kind of area where there's going to be kind of immense new historical research. I mean, there already has been. I think of recently, Daniel Rodriguez published an excellent book about the leading role that Cuba played after in the early 20th century in establishing the idea that citizens had a right to health and that it was an obligation of the state to deliver it. And I think that one of the important kind of contributions that many Latin American historians have made is to kind of refine our understanding of the origins of social democracy and suggest that actually there are important ways in which Latin American states helped to establish a number of social democratic ideas that didn't just originate like in Europe after 1945. So I think that, you know, Latin America is a big and diverse place. This book looks at some of the, I think, what I think were pervasive contradictions of capitalist economies. But of course, Latin America also had, cycles of revolution and, left-wing alternatives to the kinds of programs I'm looking at here that can be, I think, still instructive places to look. I don't think you'll ever look back and find a political program in the past that could be picked up and dropped down in the present day, or that you want to, but it is a place where there's, I think, more variety than only existed in these anti-capitalist societies, or excuse me, anti-communist societies.
That's great. Santos, do you have anything you want to come back on, or anybody else, if you have questions? Oh, please put them in the chat. There's some messages there. Do you have
Okay, I agree with you, but the feeling of some people and authors is that we are coming back in social policies, housing policies, etc. And somebody discussing about a transition period from the years of the neoclassic to another perspective, the end of.
So right, so the question of whether neoliberalism is coming to an
It's
end.
like a transition.
I mean, I think that could be.
I'm not sure. Maybe we think that we are very optimistic. Maybe, yeah.
I hope so. And I do think, I mean, look at Chile right now. It could go one of two ways. we don't know right now, and I think it's just immensely important that people, work actually to make that happen. I mean, certainly, I feel like in Latin America there's one truly backward and nostalgic side to politics, and that's the right now in Latin America. The sort of glorification of military dictatorship in Chile and Brazil, for instance, is quite terrifying. But there are left-wing possibilities that could, the question is right, whether the left has been fully transformed, given the ways in which the sites of the left in some ways were really reduced, in Chile, for instance, after the, period of dictatorship. But I do think that today you see, the protests over the last several years against neoliberal reforms all around Latin America. The rewriting of the Constitution does suggest that there's, popular demand for far more egalitarian policies, and I hope that will be possible.
Yesterday, Professor Ricardo Frende talked about the situation of Chile, the political situation in Chile, and he says that it's like an imbalance between people feelings and the politician behavior. So he said, I am optimistic, but he doesn't explain what is the reason of optimism. What is the reason for your optimism for the future?
That's interesting. What's the reason for my optimism? Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I am optimistic. I just think that we have to recognize that nothing's inevitable until it's happened, and that, certainly in Chile, you look at the election, it's less than 3%, separating the two candidates, and that's all I mean to say. I mean, this is one of the ways I think in which historians are different from social scientists. We will never predict the future, but I do think that it's more evident today than it's been, I think, in my lifetime. I mean, I was born the day that Margaret Thatcher took office, so I always, I feel like I'm writing about what is the politics of my own lifetime, and I don't feel like there's been a moment quite like the one of the last several years of, just such profound lack of legitimacy, such profound crisis of the existing political economic order, and that opens up possibilities, but it doesn't determine the direction they'll go in it. The right certainly has made a lot of that and has captured a lot of the grievances of this moment. I don't think it's inevitable that they will. Sounds like you're not convinced by that.
I have a couple of questions as well, but I do want to make sure anybody else in the session gets a chance to ask them. So please, if you either want to put them in the Q&A, feel free. I mean, Santos, do you want to continue? Or I've got a couple of questions I could ask as well, and then maybe we can come back to you if there's nobody else. Would that be all right?
Great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay,
I really did enjoy it. I thought it was fascinating, and it was so nice to hear from you. And I think one of the things you've done really convincingly is show how people traveled from America to Colombia and then they went back. I think that's a really interesting, the evidencing how those types of communications are, of who are these influential people and how they repackage themselves with a new type of advisor hat on, drawing on those experiences. I think that's really great. But I suppose what I don't, and I also like the idea of these imagined pasts that are very selective. We do it ourselves as individuals, much less as societies. I suppose I wanted to ask you was how several things. How does your approach fit in with things like path dependency theory? Mm-hmm. So that tends to suggest, as all of you know, without me explaining it, like teach you how to suck eggs, but it tells us really that there's a historical constitution of actors and institutions, and once they've set these a path of economic organization, it's very difficult to move. So your approach really quite challenges that in a way, it seems to me. That's the first question. Let me ask that first. Let's not give a big lecture of questions from me. Let's give you a chance to have a conversation more.
That's a great question. That's something I've thought about a lot. There's a funny way in which I think that path dependency is like it's a concept that historians tend not to use, but all of historical research is informed by the foundational agreement that the past matters to the trajectory of a society. And so I think that sometimes historical research can be read as actually a somewhat as actually an exploration of the very notion of path dependency. If it is the case that the past shapes the future, that all futures are not kind of equally possible, then why is that, or through what mechanisms does that come about, rather than assuming that it is so? In this case, I do think that there could be aspects of this story that actually would be could be assimilated actually into an argument about path dependency in the following sense. One of the things that you find, for instance, if you think about US history, by the time of the Great Depression, the US government has already made decisions in the 19th century that mean that when the New Deal comes along and the US government has to decide, what kinds of institutions do you have if you want to implement a big policy, what kinds of institutions do you have that have scale, that have administrative capacity, and there are not that many institutions in the United States that can do those things. You've got the military, you've got large industrial corporations. Now, the New Deal does also create new kinds of state capacities that can carry those out. But one thing I find over and over again is that business is there. It's large corporations are both for ideological reasons, because neither of these governments is being run by socialists, and they have a benign view of basically capitalists who align themselves with some fictive vision of the public interest, but also for very practical reasons. They are there and ready to take on large responsibilities. And that has political consequences. The way in which sort of both of these states systematically enrich and strengthen capital through their activities makes it so that when the crises come in the 1970s, some of the groups that are best poised to take advantage of that certainly are, groups of capitalists. So that could be, kind of an argument about sort of path dependency, which doesn't take path dependency as a given, I suppose, or as kind of just a theoretical background, but tries to explain why it might be so. The other thing that I think this book tries to do is suggest that American societies have a lot in common with each other. And so if we're trying to think about paths, I guess, or historical transformations, we might not want to think just in national units and think about kind of hard essentialized comparisons between supposedly distinct cases that are on separate paths, but think about the Americas as actually on a trajectory where they're colonized contemporaneously. They're both formed through contact and conflict with indigenous societies, through the transatlantic slave trade, through independence in the age of revolutions, and then all of the many kind of parallel conflicts actually that arise from the nature of independence. that's not to say that American societies all deal with those conflicts in the same way or turn out the same. But I do think that you can construct sort of arguments about the Americas actually having a shared history. That said, I do think that the book pushes against, to the extent that kind of path dependency arguments can be kind of mobilized to suggest that, like, well, the United States is an exceptional kind of country, or Colombia is an exceptional kind of country because of their distinctive pasts, or because of decisions made, or and so on. I do think that absolutely the book pushes against that, and the book also, in a way that I think is just sort of typical of historical research, tries to balance a sort of attention to kind of structure with attention to contingency. I don't think we should make too much of contingency, in the sense that, not all futures were equally likely, but there were multiple futures that were possible, and the contact between the societies is one of the things that could change the terms of conflict in each one.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've had elections in America where you had the difficulty of actually getting machines to count the votes. The shards in Florida are a good example of,
yeah,
were several futures possible, and because nobody invested in decent election machinery, you got a different president to the one you should have got. And we have a situation in the UK where we have a Brexit result which nobody expected, not even the Brexiteers, because we have things like very influential. I mean, there's a fantastic film called The Brexit, the Uncivil War, and I'm not going to go on about it for the UK, but it's really interesting how, significant figures like Dominic Cummings employed the Canadian intelligentsia to get an algorithm to identify unregistered voters who were Brexiteers and got them registered. Now, if we hadn't done that, we would still be in the European Union. So I think you're absolutely right that there are multiple futures and they're not determined. Accidents happen. I wanted, in the path dependency one, okay. Maybe the other question I want to ask you was about this is a really rich and really challenging project. I mean, what did you, as a researcher, find the most challenging thing that you encountered in trying to write it? Because there's always a moment of hair pulling and like, oh my God, why am I doing this? And oh, will it work? And then one day there's I got it. So do you want to tell us from that perspective? Because it's just a fascinating study.
Thank you. There were many challenges, honestly. I guess one challenge, honestly, was deciding which connections I was going to focus on, because I started off by choosing some of the Colombian projects I was going to look at. I knew I wanted to look at, the creation of the CBC. I wanted to look at housing. I wanted to look at the creation of new economics programs at Colombian universities. And when I started following, people and institutions through those projects, the places they went in the US afterwards were so varied and numerous, it was quite overwhelming, actually. And so what I decided to do was to focus in the end on particular areas where I thought I could show that Latin American experience made a difference to the course of US history. Because some people go back and they reintegrate themselves into longstanding projects, or they get involved in something new, but they don't make a big difference. It probably would have turned out the same way whether or not they were involved. And so that was a difficult sort of challenge, but I sort of ended up concluding that US housing and as well as the history of US training and education were areas where we really could see the influence. But I think there is a lot more that I could have figured out if I had all the time in the world to study other connections. The other thing that honestly was very difficult for me was to sort of think about first of all, like why I was finding David Lilienthal sounding to me like Ronald Reagan. What was the logic of this? And that was where first of all, reading the fact that I was reading economists of this period was very helpful, and it was actually in reading Lachlan Curry, who has some really interesting kind of discussions of the mixed economy, that I recognized how powerful that concept was for actors at the time, and it helped me think about that. I also had to think about what the political implications were, frankly, of the argument that I was making about kind of continuity between these two periods, because I mean, I should say that when I went to begin this research, my understanding of history was the story about, you know, the Chicago School and the Mont Pelerin Society playing this, you know, absolutely pivotal role in kind of overturning Keynesianism and developmentalism. And I have great respect for, I mean, I learned so much from, you know, the many, you know, social scientists, historians, and social movements that made that story clear and did, I think, really invaluable work in you know, debunking what were incredibly pernicious myths about kind of neoliberalism as freedom, as, you know, kind of the sort of popular, necessary, and inevitable, you know, final end of world history. And I didn't want my book to be read as a cheap dismissal, I guess, of what I think has been a really important form of political dissent, essentially. Writing on neoliberalism has sort of turned those celebratory narratives on their heads in a way that I think played a very essential function in political debate and brought to light, you know, really important facts about economic injustice. And so I wanted to make sure that, I guess, the book wasn't going to be used as a battering ram to say that, you know, the welfare state was a stupid idea, or developmentalism should never have been tried, that it was sort of poisoned from the beginning. That, to me, that walking that political line was tricky in the book, honestly.
Okay, well, I think that's fantastic. We have one question in the question and answer from Patricio Marcelo Cortez Rodriguez. But before I read out Patricia's question, Jacob could put in the chat, if you'd like to join us in a digital social space, bring your own gin and tonic or cup of tea, whatever you like. And it's a very nice space where we can chit chat. It's like mingle and things like that. So Jacob will put the link in so you can click on it and you'll get there after this. I'll read out Patricia's question now and then hand over to Amy for the final answer and wrap up because we're just bang on time. So Patricia wrote, what do you think of the economic inequality that capitalism generates and that leads to social discontent as happens in Chile, the protests? What is your opinion? I think we discussed it a bit with Santos, but if you want to respond particularly to that one.
I think that is what none of these programs could reckon with. Both the developmentalist programs that I look at in Colombia and the welfare state programs in the United States were sort of predicated on the idea that growth, that you could resort to growth rather than redistribution, that you basically could, that social justice didn't depend on actually any kind of antagonistic reform that would, you know, look at economic inequality as a product of exploitation. Or that, you know, would look at sort of capitalist growth as something that would systemically create inequality. And they, you know, expressed just enormous faith in the idea that if you could generate growth and then if you could train and prepare all people to go and compete and participate in it, everybody would benefit from that. And I think that, you know, redistribution is like the great untried alternative. These societies resorted to growth over and over again to avoid really difficult questions about redistribution. And I think that, you know, the kinds of protests that you're pointing to in Chile, I mean, they're pointing to a number of things. They're not principally arguing with the kind of mid-century growth programs. In some ways, they want other forms of growth. But that's one thing certainly that kind of neoliberalism inherited from this earlier period, is the sort of the, you know, absolute refusal to engage with redistribution. I mean, just as a fundamental point, I certainly agree that capitalism generates inequality and that has to be faced.
Great. Well, thank you, Amy. I'll wind up now because we're just slightly over time. And I just want to say a massive thank you on behalf of all of us, because I think you've provided a really fantastic session to close the conference. I'm sure people are very tired having discussed for 3 days. But, you know, thank you very much. Congratulations on the book. Congratulations on all the awards that you're getting. You'll be having them on the wall, I'm sure. Yeah, and looking forward to seeing you in Amsterdam. And we must talk more about how you want to organise your session. And thank you to Santos and Yulimar for organising a great session. Thanks to all the SASE team who have done their best to help it work. And thank you to all of you for attending. And I hope you've really enjoyed it and that we hope to see you in Amsterdam.